So today, with the church throughout the world, we celebrate a feast day, so a kind of a second rank, if you will, kind of like the silver medal feast day in honor of St. Luke, the evangelist. A very fascinating person, right? I mean, of all the evangelists, he's probably the most interesting, if nothing else. If he had lived 15 centuries later, he would have been called a Renaissance man, but he never lived to see the Renaissance, but he was, in a certain sense. It's hard to tell what his background was. He may have been a Greek pagan, as it were, who, through the ministry of the church in Antioch, becomes a Christian. He appears to have been a physician, a doctor, right? As such people were understood in that time, and also an artist, right? In fact, all the icons of Mary that we're familiar with, right? Like true icons, right? Going, like Our Lady of Czestochowa, all those different ones that we're familiar with, all trace back. I mean, they're all copies of copies of copies of copies, and the original, as the tradition holds, was done by Luke, right? Of Mary with the child Jesus. Right? Again, that's an aside, but an interesting aspect of Luke and his tremendously different gifts. There's a very special connection between St. Luke and St. Anthony of Padua. And that is, for probably 700 years or so, maybe a little longer, less than 800, more than 700. Our St. Anthony here at the shrine was the next door neighbor of most of St. Luke, right? Most of St. Luke, the relics of St. Luke, are in the big church next door to the Basilica of St. Anthony in Padua. Now, as these things happened, one of Luke's ribs is now in Thebes, where he died probably, and I believe his head is in Prague, but the rest of him is in Padua, right next door to where our relic of St. Anthony lived until he moved to America. Okay? So kind of an interesting connection. There's a beautiful, if you ever get and not many people go there. If you ever get to Italy and you go to Padua, make sure you go next door to visit St. Luke. It's a beautiful church, Santa Justinia. Those were all just interesting things about St. Luke. When I was a student here, this was back in a million years ago, right? Right after the dinosaurs that went extinct, right? This was a formation house, right? This was a house for students. And over the years, it had different kind of functions. It was a novitiate. It was the seminary for guys studying philosophy. Then it was later in its time, it was the residence for students studying theology and the novitiate. And when I was here as a novice, it was a big house. There was probably 35 people living here then. Brother Pascal was here then. And in those days, and this place was very rarely open to the public. No, y'all never would have been here in those days except in Advent and Lent or Greccio time, right? But in those days, because this was where we prayed, this was the friar's chapel, all these benches here were gone. They were not here. They were someplace else in the world. And all the friars sat in the choir stalls here, right? And again, everybody had their place. I was in that block, first row, third from the end. That was my seat for 5 years when I lived here in those days. And this is where we prayed together. Now, if you look at the choir stalls, and if you count them, you will discover that there are 72 choir stalls. That's not a coincidence, as we heard from the gospel today, right? And the Lord appointed 72 disciples whom he sent ahead of him in pairs to every town and place he intended to visit. And then there's a little description of what these folks were supposed to do, right? But that's what Jesus did, right? He chose 12 kind of like close companions, and these were the people that were supposed to be the witnesses to his entire life. And then he also sent out disciples to kind of like the advance crew to go to the places where he was coming. And he chose 72 disciples, right? Hence, 72 choir stalls. Everything in this building is meaningful, right? And that's one of the examples of that, right? Because those of us who were here saw ourselves as, right, the disciples of Jesus who were going before Jesus before he came back, right? That was the understanding of the meaning of these 72 choir stalls. Now, the interesting thing with that is 72 is probably a mistake, right? Most of the ancient texts say 70. And in fact, most of the definitive texts today will say 70. St. Jerome's Vulgate says 72, so we Catholics tend to hold on to that. But it's probably 70, because 70 is a meaningful number too. Does anybody remember what that was? No? Okay. Book of Numbers, right? Moses is getting, Moses is there, at the tent, right? And he's getting pestered 24 hours a day. All these people come and settle this case, settle this dispute, do this, do that. He was getting worn out. So God chooses 70 other men, right, to kind of like take care of the small stuff. Hence the meaning of 70, right? It really should be 70 here, probably, right? But Catholics like 72 choir stalls, 72 disciples going before the Lord, right? 70 or 72 disciples going, helping, assisting Moses, God, in that ministry, right? It's a wonderful image, isn't it? And of course, the life here has changed, right? There's only, I think, 8 of us here right now. We would rattle around if we had prayers in here, because we're like good Catholics too. There'd be one guy down here, one guy here, it would be a nightmare. So we have a smaller chapel upstairs. But who is here now? You, right? You are the 72 disciples, right? You are the ones who go before the Lord, proclaiming. You are the evangelists, right? Proclaiming the coming of the Lord. Again, you're not standing on a soapbox in the street corner, right? But through the way you live your life, right? Right? You all fall in to that heritage of the 72, right? And those of you sitting and those of you here, whenever you're here, that symbolism hopefully is meaningful to you as well. That it gives you a little sense of why you're here, right? We come here to be evangelized, right, by the great works of the evangelists, like St. Luke. And then having been evangelized, hopefully we become evangelizers, right? The harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. Ask the master of the harvest to send out laborers for his harvest. That's you. You're it. Tag, you're it. So get out there and evangelize. But don't beat people up, right? Don't hold a sword over their heads. It's not how we do it. Live the faith. Live the faith. And by doing that, you too will be part of the 72. You too will be an evangelist.